everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky, and today I want to talk about the Idaho 4 case. Now, as we all know, there's some very important hearings going on right now in the Ada County Courthouse, and we're going to be getting into all that in my next few videos. Now, this weekend, I'm going to be doing a members only live, and we're going to be doing a recap of what happened in the hearings in the state against Bryan Kohberger. So stay tuned for that because I'm going to make a community post and let you know the day and time. But again, this is going to be a members only live, and we're going to be doing a recap about everything that happened in these hearings this week. But today, I want to talk about something that we've talked about in the past, and it's just something that has been nagging me since the very beginning, since we started hearing information about this investigation. I want to talk about something that we've discussed in the past, and I want to go through it step by step and kind of explain why I have so many questions about this, because the pieces really are not fitting together. Let's go back to November the 29th, 2022. This is 16 days after the Idaho 4 crimes occurred. 2 Washington State University police officers are searching for this white Hyundai Elantra that Moscow Police Department has put out a be on the lookout for law enforcement to keep an eye out for. Now, one of these officers is looking through the WSU database, and the other officer is driving around Pullman, Washington, looking for this white Hyundai Elantra. Now, the officer who is looking in the database finds a white Hyundai Elantra that belongs to Bryan Kohberger. The other officer who is driving around Pullman, Washington, at almost the exact same time, puts eyes on a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra. Now, they find this car in the parking lot of Bryan Kohberger's apartment complex. So what they do is they run the information on this Hyundai, and it comes back to Bryan Kohberger. They run Bryan Kohberger's name through the database at Washington State University, and they're able to get some information on him and get a look at his picture. Now, they both agree that Bryan Kohberger matches the description that was given to investigators by Dylan Mortensen. So just over 2 weeks after the Idaho 4 crimes occur on November the 13th, these 2 Washington State University police officers have located this white Hyundai Elantra that apparently law enforcement is frantically looking for. They also determine that the owner of this Hyundai Elantra matches the description of one of the witnesses who was inside the house at the time of the crimes. So this would be a very important lead. You know, you would think that Washington State University police might drive over to Moscow Police Department 15 minutes away and let them know about this very important lead. Maybe at least just call them directly, investigators, maybe the lead investigator, Payne, and let them know that they have potentially found this white Hyundai Elantra along with a potential suspect. But they don't do this. Instead, they allegedly call this in as a tip. Now, these investigators really seem to like this tip line, but it seems like they would have been a little more, urgent about getting this information over to investigators so that they could look into Bryan Kohberger. But it doesn't seem like there was really any urgency there because they basically just call it in as a tip. So, you guys, we're not talking about someone who stole a car. They're not looking for someone who committed a misdemeanor crime. They're looking for an individual who took the lives of 4 people with a knife. This is a very, very dangerous person and not someone that you want walking around the streets of your community. So it would seem as though time would be very important. They would want to catch this individual and get him off the streets as soon as possible. So why they would call it in as a tip just doesn't make sense to me. But Washington State University Police did have Bryan Kohberger's name on November the 29th. And as we all know, he would go on to become the sole suspect in the Idaho 4 crimes. So they had Bryan Kohberger's name 16 days after the crimes occurred. Now, after Washington State University Police call in this tip, then what happens? Because we know from Brett Payne's testimony that he didn't hear about Bryan Kohberger's name until December 19th. So almost 3 weeks go by after Washington State University Police find this car, as well as Bryan Kohberger, and the time that Brett Payne learns Bryan Kohberger's name. So what happened in that 3 weeks? It seems as though Washington State University Police might follow up on this tip. Maybe call Moscow Police Department. Maybe call investigators and ask them, if they followed up on this lead. Because this is a very important lead. I mean, you found the car that they were looking for, or at least the type of car that they were looking for, and you found that the owner matches the description. So why wouldn't they call and follow up on this lead and ask if anything came of it? Even if they didn't call to follow up on their lead, you would think that someone at Moscow Police Department, Idaho State Police, or the feds would have said, maybe we should get with Washington State University Police and see if they may have any information about a potential suspect. It just seems really strange to me that WSU police do not relay this information, this very important information, over to Moscow Police Department. That just doesn't really make any sense. Why would you let your biggest lead to date just slip through the cracks? Now, the other night I was watching a show and it was on a mainstream channel, and Brian Entin was talking about this investigation. And normally I don't watch mainstream channels, but they were talking about this investigation, and I was curious about how he was going to describe the timeline. And what Brian Entin said was that this investigation started on November the 29th, when those two officers at Washington State University found Bryan Kohberger's car. Now, I'm not saying that this is factual. This is what Brian Entin was saying. But it actually makes sense. It makes more sense than what law enforcement was telling us. Now, he goes on to say that they continue the investigation. So we've heard that they called in a tip to investigators, but Brian Entin is saying that they continue the investigation after they find his vehicle and identify him. So what they do is they run a DMV search on Bryan Kohberger, and this is where they discover that he had been pulled over 2 times since he moved to Pullman, Washington. And during one of those traffic stops in August, he gave law enforcement his telephone number. How they know this is they go back to the body cam footage of his traffic stop in August, and they can hear him and see him give this officer his phone number. So Brian Entin says that now investigators don't even need a warrant because they have his phone number. So they begin to investigate this phone number, and they get his cell phone data, but they can't put him in the location at the time of the crimes. So they don't come up with anything. But what Brian Entin says is that they keep a very close eye on him. And eventually he plans his trip to drive back to Albrightsville, Pennsylvania with his dad for the winter holiday. So Bryan Kohberger, according to Brian Entin, was being watched by investigators before he even left on his trip to Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. So this would have been before December 12th. Now, this would make sense because why wouldn't they follow up on this lead from November the 29th? These two Washington State University officers found this car and a potential suspect that matches the description. So it would make sense that they did continue this investigation from November the 29th. But what doesn't make sense is that who was conducting this investigation? Is it possible that Washington State University police relayed this lead to the feds rather than Moscow Police Department and Brett Payne? Because like I said, Brett Payne testified that he does not hear Bryan Kohberger's name until December 19th. But why? Why wouldn't the feds inform Moscow Police Department and Brett Payne that they had a person of interest, that they were investigating Bryan Kohberger? That's what doesn't make sense to me, that they had Bryan Kohberger's name 3 weeks before Brett Payne says that he ever heard that name. So it seems weird that the lead investigator would not be informed about Bryan Kohberger. And, in Brett Payne's testimony, he said that him and the feds and Idaho State Police were all meeting sometimes twice a day to update each other on their investigation. So why wouldn't they inform the lead investigator that they were investigating Bryan Kohberger? That's what doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. It almost seems like they don't want us to know that they were investigating Bryan Kohberger as soon as 2 weeks after the crimes occurred. But why? Brett Payne testifies that he hears Bryan Kohberger's name for the very first time on December 19th, when the feds call in a tip that Bryan Kohberger's DNA is a potential match to the DNA found on the knife sheath. He's a possible person of interest, and they basically say you should probably look into this guy. Well, obviously, if they're calling in the tip on December 19th saying that Bryan Kohberger was a potential match, then that means that they were previously investigating Bryan Kohberger. So it's very possible they've been investigating him since the 29th. And obviously, they were investigating him before the 19th, before they call in this tip. Now, Brett Payne says in his testimony that after they get this tip, they began doing an investigation. They began doing DMV searches, and they began their basic and standard investigation into Bryan Kohberger. But the feds have already done this investigation. They've already gone through his DMV information. So why would they call in this tip and then allow Moscow Police Department to just do a whole new investigation? Now, I've heard a lot of people say that the IGG did not lead investigators to Bryan Kohberger, that it actually led to Bryan Kohberger's family. So when they collected the garbage out of the Kohberger's trash and they processed this garbage and they found Bryan Kohberger's dad's DNA, they basically created a family tree and they reduced it down to Bryan Kohberger because that was his biological son and he lived 15 minutes away from the crime scene. So they reduced it down through his dad. But that really doesn't make a lot of sense because they were obviously already on to Bryan Kohberger by the 19th. They had already processed the IGG and it possibly led to Bryan Kohberger. That's why they called in this tip to Moscow PD and to Brett Payne. So really the IGG would have led to Bryan Kohberger because if it didn't, why were they at Bryan Kohberger's house collecting garbage? Now, they didn't collect the piece of trash that had Bryan Kohberger's dad's DNA on it until December 27th. They called in the tip on December 19th and let Brett Payne know that Bryan Kohberger was potentially the individual whose DNA was on this knife sheath. So, how did they go about collecting the garbage 8 days later and processing it and then narrowing it down from Bryan Kohberger's dad to Bryan Kohberger when they already had Bryan Kohberger's name on the 19th? That was the reason that they were in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, collecting DNA out of the trash. So it wasn't that process where they used his dad's DNA to narrow it down to Bryan Kohberger, because they already had Bryan Kohberger's name on December 19th, and they made it very clear that he was a potential source of DNA that was on this knife sheath. So this is 8 days before they even collect the trash out of the Kohberger household. In my opinion, they had Bryan Kohberger's name on November the 29th, which we know that they did, but we don't know how WSU police passed that on to investigators. But it would seem as though Bryan Kohberger was under investigation long before December 19th. So the IGG must have led to Bryan Kohberger, or they wouldn't even have been searching through his family's trash. It doesn't make any sense to say that the IGG was reduced down from Bryan Kohberger's dad to Bryan Kohberger after they collected the garbage, because they were already calling in a tip on the 19th that he was a potential source of DNA on this knife sheath, and they didn't collect the garbage until December 27th. So that's, I'm kind of with Ann Taylor on this. What led law enforcement to Bryan Kohberger? Now, I also think it's strange that Idaho State Police tried to process this DNA, and they had no luck. Othram Labs tried to process this DNA. They had no luck. Then the FBI comes in, and they're able to find a match. And in my opinion, that's because they had been investigating him since November the 29th. But what I don't understand is why Brett Payne was not informed of this. And I know I keep saying this, but that's where it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up that Brett Payne had no knowledge of this investigation. And they were obviously investigating Bryan Kohberger before Brett Payne heard his name on December 19th. That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why wouldn't they want us to know that they had already found Bryan Kohberger just over 2 weeks after the crimes were committed? Why wouldn't they want us to know that these two officers from WSU found his car and identified him, and that's when the investigation started? I mean, they make it sound as though this investigation into Bryan Kohberger began on December 19th. But that doesn't even add up itself, because obviously the feds were investigating Bryan Kohberger before the 19th because they already had information on Bryan Kohberger. It seems weird that they wouldn't want us to know that they would kind of be trying to hide that. It seems odd to me that campus police found Bryan Kohberger's car just randomly parked in a parking lot at his apartment complex. There were 90 white Hyundai Elantras that were registered to park at the university, and they happened to run across Bryan Kohberger's. Now, that's something else, is that out of 90 registered white Hyundai Elantras that, were permitted to park at this university, law enforcement received 22,000 tips about white Hyundai Elantras. 22,000 tips on 90 Hyundai Elantras. Now, I understand that multiple people could be calling about the same car that's driving around. But 22,000 tips about 90 white Hyundai Elantras? I mean, it makes me wonder, did they really get that many tips? Because they obviously didn't follow up on all of them, because they didn't even follow up on the tip from Washington State University Police. Now, in my opinion, I think that WSU police passed this information on to the feds rather than Moscow Police Department. And maybe that's why Brett Payne didn't know anything about Bryan Kohberger. But it just seems odd to me that they wouldn't inform Brett Payne about this potential suspect, who would eventually become the sole suspect in the Idaho 4 case. So this investigation does not make sense. And I have to say, Ann Taylor was right from the very beginning to ask the question, what led law enforcement to Bryan Kohberger? Because it was not the trash that they pulled out of his parents' garbage, and it wasn't because they had reduced it down from Bryan Kohberger's dad. They already had his name. They were already investigating him. So really, the way they describe it, WSU police just finding Bryan Kohberger's car on November the 29th would have been all for nothing. Because by the time Brett Payne hears Bryan Kohberger's name on December 19th, they have his information. Because Brett Payne said that he speaks to WSU police soon after he gets this tip, and they let him know that they had found Bryan Kohberger's car and identified Bryan Kohberger. But really, it would have all been for nothing because at that time, Brett Payne already had Bryan Kohberger's information. They included it in the PCA. They include the WSU officers finding Bryan Kohberger's car and identifying him in the PCA. But Brett Payne testifies that he knows nothing about Bryan Kohberger until December 19th. Makes no sense at all. Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Now, we are going to be talking about these hearings that just happened in these past few days. So stay tuned for that. And I hope that y'all had an amazing day. We'll see you next time.